Okay, continuing on. Hopefully, you were able to come up with some information for these sequences. For the First Opium War, X and Y should be Great Britain and China. Second one here, ended by the Treaty of Nanking or Nanjing. Really considered to be an unfair treaty, very heavily in favor of the British. And that's ultimately going to lead us to this second Opium War that's going to be fought. If you look here at this map, you are going to see on the key here that there are several different groups that are included here. We mentioned when we were talking about the First Opium War that it really wound up being a lot of Europe against China in this because they all wanted to have some sort of what we call a sphere of influence. They wanted to have places where they had access to China to be able to sell items to China, essentially. So the second war is really going to be about that. It's going to be who's going to have influence where. You've got the British involved, you've got the French involved, the Japanese, the Russians, you've got the Germans. Everybody wants to have a piece of China, and that's what the Second Opium War is ultimately going to be about. Who is going to be able to control trade in certain areas in China? So ultimately, the second Opium War is going to go an awful lot like the political cartoon that we see here. As we look at this, because you've got all of these other groups involved, this is obviously the second Opium War, not the first one that we're talking about. And if you think back, it should call to mind the Berlin Conference because this really is essentially the same thing. Just rather than Africa, we're now in China. So we're seeing really kind of the same kind of thing. So the question usually becomes, how do we get the name Boxer Rebellion? Where does Boxer Rebellion really come from? Well, the story goes that you had groups of British soldiers that were going out across the Chinese countryside. And as they were doing that, they would inevitably come across towns and villages. And at times they would see people who were doing things like this. They were actually practicing martial arts. The British soldiers believed that what they were actually doing was boxing. And it becomes known as the Boxer Rebellion because British soldiers saw this, thought people were boxing. This is just another example of that Eurocentric view. This was martial arts. This wasn't boxing, but because boxing was a British thing, boxing was something that they were familiar with. Ultimately, that Eurocentric view is going to come out, and they're going to call it the Boxer Rebellion because that's kind of what matched what they were seeing. Ultimately, because of the fighting that's going to go on, they're going to come across um, things like this as they continue to march throughout the Chinese countryside. Um, People trying to make examples of the Chinese Christians, the missionaries that have been brought over, cutting off heads and hanging them on, the wall outside the city. This was absolutely appalling to the British, and ultimately led to them, trying to come down very, very harshly to stop this Boxer rebellion against Christians in this part of the world. So at this point, you're going to move on to the next item on the sheet. You're going to have a short reading about the Boxer uprising. You're going to look for some specific questions, and then you'll answer some review questions on Canvas to finish the lesson.